Hey everybody, it's Akari. Welcome to my latest video. The very first video I ever uploaded onto this channel was basically my attempt to cover everything great about Negima in about 15 minutes. But if you've read it, then you know that that's just not possible. There's way too much to talk about. So instead of trying to cover the whole series in one go, I'm going to tackle it arc by arc, so I can go into detail about what I like and dislike about each part of the story. These will just be my own, very biased opinions about the manga and my experience with it. I'm going to be going through each arc in order, so make sure you subscribe if you don't want to miss any of them. But if all that sounds good to you, let's jump right into my very first Negima arc review. The first arc of the series is the child teacher arc, which is a little bit weird considering that he's still a child and a teacher in the next arc, but whatever. It goes from chapter 1 to 15, and starts with Neji graduating from the Meridiana Academy of Magic. Even though he's graduated, he still only has a probationary license. Graduates essentially have to complete a field assignment to become official mages. His best friend Anya is assigned to be a fortune teller in London. So what's Neji's job? Teaching English at an all-girls school in Japan, even though he's only 10 years old. This is very clearly not normal, as Anya and Nekane both rightfully freak out about it, but that's what the diploma says, so they just have to go with it. This sets the tone right away. A 10-year-old boy teaching a class of middle school girls? That is ridiculous. Well, I guess you better go do that. Anyway, he comes to Mahora and ends up rooming with two of his students, Asuna and Konoka. Of course, all the students think he's just the cutest thing ever. All except for Asuna. She hates kids and can't stand the fact that she has to share a room with Neji, because of course she does. I'll admit, this does seem super cliche. The angry tsundere female lead that hates the main character? Yeah, never seen that one before. But to be fair, she actually does have a reason to dislike him. First of all, she's replacing the teacher that she has a crush on. And second, literally the very first thing he ever said to her was that her love would be unrequited. Yeah, that one's on you, Neji. I mean, I love you, man, but that was a super dumb thing to say. Anyway, Asuna finds out he is a mage immediately. And of course, the fan servicey hijinks ensue. Like when he tries to erase her memories, but accidentally erases her underwear. A common mistake, I'm sure. Or when she forced him to drink a love potion and all the other girls started chasing after him. Or that breast size competition, where he made her boobs grow till they explode. It's pretty ridiculous. These first few chapters mostly focus on Asuna, but we do get introduced to a few other characters, like Notica Best Girl Miyazaki, who would go on to be a fan favorite and one of my personal favorite Negima characters. But she actually does very little in this arc. She develops a crush on Neji, and that's about it. She is involved in the Library Island mini arc, but she doesn't actually travel to Library Island with the others. Speaking of which, Library Island is definitely where this arc hits its climax. Up until this point, magic had basically just been used to set up the joke. But Library Island is where magic actually starts getting worked into the plot. Turns out, there's a massive library underneath the school. Supposedly, on the lowest level, there's a magic book that can make you smarter just by reading it. So of course, the 5 worst students in the class, also known as the Baka Rangers, go looking for it so they can pass their exams. I absolutely love this setup. Functionally, Library Island is just an ordinary dungeon you'd find in any fantasy anime or game. But because it's a library, it fits perfectly into the school setting. They're not trying to defeat the Demon Lord or save the world. They're just trying to pass their finals. It's so mundane, yet so over the top at the same time. And that's the kind of thing that Negima excels at. And Library Island is just a really nice location. It's a nice change of scenery from the classrooms and the dorms, and it has a real air of mystery and wonder about it. At this point, the series is more focused on comedy, so there's no physical fighting. but it's still a really fun adventure. There's this magic rock golem with a giant hammer that makes them play Twister with English questions. And for some reason, Neji doesn't just give them the answers, even though he's standing right there. I mean, they never said he couldn't help them. But of course he can't. He's their teacher after all. He can't just do the work for them. Clearly, it's much better to just give them hints and hope they get it right. Whoops. In the end, they lose the book, but they still pass the exam. Not because of magic, but because they actually studied, and because Neji is a legitimately good teacher. They don't take any shortcuts, and their efforts pay off. They all pass, and Neji is recognized as an official teacher. It's a pretty solid little story. I've mentioned this before, but Negima started out primarily as a romantic comedy, and later transitioned to shonen action. So this arc is still centered on comedy. You're probably expecting me to say that makes it bad, but I honestly enjoyed it. I admit it's not as good on a reread, just because I've read so many rom-com and harem mangas since then. But it did get a few good chuckles out of me, and the unique premise helps it stand out. Neji is super likable, and all the girls have distinctive personalities. I know I complain about Asuna being a generic tsundere, but she's honestly not that bad. At the very least, I've seen far worse, and she does get better in later arcs. After Library Island, we end the arc with a few one-off slice-of-life chapters about some of the other students. There isn't any action, but there's some surprisingly good character building stuff in here. The best is definitely with Ayaka. Right from her introduction, she has this weird, unhealthy obsession with Neji. But then, it turns out, she was actually going to have a little brother, who was unfortunately either stillborn or miscarried. And he would have been about Neji's age. That's why she's so attached to him, 'cause he's the little brother she never got to have. And Asuna, who up until this point had just had this childish rivalry with Ayaka, tells Neji to go visit her on her brother's would-be birthday, 'cause she knows it would mean the world to her. Yes, I'm not kidding. This actually happened in this stupid little story about a 10-year-old wizard. But now I have to throw out some criticism, because this arc does have what I consider to be the two worst chapters in the entire series. Chapters 5 and 6. Dodgeball Showdown, Fight On Girls, Parts 1 and 2. The only thing that really happens here is that Neji's class pick a fight with some high schoolers, and they settle it with a game of dodgeball. That's really about it. There isn't really anything wrong with this, it's just not that interesting. First of all, this could have been done in a single chapter. You didn't have to stretch it into two. Second, the high schoolers are just stock standard bullies, and they never show up in the story again. Actually, the head bully does maybe show up in this one panel near the end of the school festival, assuming that this is her. But even if it is, we still never even get her name. Although, this is the first time we get to see the Baka Ranger's skills in action, so that's one plus. Or at least it would be if this wasn't literally one chapter before Library Island, where we get to see them do a lot more in a much better story. So the dodgeball showdown is just kind of pointless. The only other thing it really does is show Neji's inexperience as a teacher, because he couldn't do anything to break up the fight. It's kind of cool to shine a spotlight on Neji's inexperience and naivete, but you could argue that the entire series is about him growing up and overcoming his inexperience. So we don't really need it here. Though I admit, it was pretty satisfying to see Nautica school the supposed dodgeball experts by citing an obscure rule, and it's a really good way to show how smart and well-read she is. But I don't think that's quite enough to justify these two chapters. I know I'm being too harsh. After all, a dodgeball competition is exactly the kind of thing you would expect to see in a manga like this. And I probably wouldn't complain if it was just one chapter. But I think we get a lot less substance out of these 2 chapters than some of the individual chapters in this arc. You could skip them entirely and not really miss anything. I think every other chapter is either funnier, more creative, or more meaningful. Like chapter 15. It's the last chapter of the arc, and the only one to focus on Konoha. Not a whole lot happens, but there's a really good message about not being in such a rush to grow up, and that it's okay to wait for the right partner. Good stuff. Okay, before I wrap up, let me quickly address the elephant in the room. Whenever I tell someone to read Negima, they will inevitably ask, can I skip this arc? Or what chapter can I skip to? Something along those lines. And this is a really hard question for me to answer. I can't speak for everyone, but in my opinion, skipping the first arc of Negima is kinda like skipping the first arc of Hunter x Hunter. And just to be clear, I actually really like the Hunter exam arc. But a very common complaint is that there's very little action in it. That's because it's all about building the world and introducing the characters. We learned so much about Gon, Killua, Kurapika, and Leorio in that arc, and I doubt we would care about them as much if we didn't spend so much time with them. And we couldn't really do that if we had to juggle Nen and Chimera Ants at the same time. I feel the same way about the child teacher arc. I know that there are editorial reasons that Akamatsu couldn't tell the story he wanted right from the beginning, but it still works. And honestly, the story might be better off for it in the long run. This arc gives us Neji's motivation, introduces us to the characters, and sets up a lot of story elements. This is where we first learn about the Pactio system and Library Island, both of which will become major plot points going forward. If you skipped this arc, then Ayaka is just an annoying brat to you, and you wouldn't know or care who Ku is when she shows up in the Kyoto arc. It is a bit of a slow burn, but that doesn't make it bad. I know it's not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's only 15 chapters. You could probably get through it in an afternoon. If you have to skip something, just skip chapters 5 and 6. But I really like the rest of this arc. If I had to rank it, I'd probably give it a 7 out of 10. It's nothing groundbreaking, but there's a real charm to it. The casual, lighthearted tone makes it easy to get into, while still being entertaining and laying the groundwork for the rest of the story. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts on the child teacher arc. And of course, let me know what you guys thought of it in the comments. The Evangeline arc is next. If you don't want to miss it, make sure you subscribe and turn those notifications on. You guys keep being awesome, and I'll see you all next time.